Russia is sitting on a ticking time bomb, primed to go off at the minute a peace deal is reached to end the war in Ukraine. You see, over the past 3.5 years, Moscow's sent over 1 million young men to fight against Kyiv. These men, some of them career soldiers, others conscripts, and many convicted prisoners, were promised glory and riches. Instead, they're returning home to find runaway inflation and a battered economy. For some, the next step is obvious. They will take the skills honed through combat in Ukraine and sell them to the highest bidder. Criminal gangs across the country are already jostling to hire these veterans. Others won't even need a gang, choosing instead to go into business for themselves. And this isn't speculation. It's something that the Russian state has already begun to witness. In October 2024, Verstka, an independent Russian media outlet, identified almost 500 cases where veterans have either harmed or killed someone after coming back home. What makes these numbers particularly worrying is the fact that most Russian soldiers are yet to return from the front line. The Kremlin is aware. Behind the grand parades and fiery speeches, officials are quietly bracing for an even greater surge in violent crime that risks spillover beyond the country's borders. Now the question is, can anything be done to stop this time bomb from exploding? A monster of the state's own making. Now, it's tempting to look at Russia's looming instability and see it as an unavoidable aftershock of war. After all, every nation that marches into war brings some of that violence home. However, what makes Russia unique is that the violence is the result of a series of decisions made by the Kremlin during the course of the war. Decisions that, with the benefit of hindsight, look less like strategic necessities and more like risky gambles. The first of these was the choice to recruit convicts, including murderers, rapists, and thieves, into the war machine. In late 2022, it became clear to the Kremlin that this special military operation might just last a teeny bit longer than 3 days. So they dispatched Yevgeny Prigozhin, at the time a key Putin ally and the head of the shadowy paramilitary outfit, the Wagner Group, to prisons all across the country to get recruits for the army. According to Vladimir Ashekin, the head of a Russian prisoners' rights group, the Wagner Group was offering 200,000 rubles, that's approximately $2,700, an amnesty for 6 months of voluntary service in Ukraine if the prisoners returned alive. For some of the men trapped inside Russia's overcrowded and violent prisons, joining the war seemed better than serving their sentences. Others, such as Rustam Borakov, were lured by the notion of returning home not just alive, but as a pardoned man, ready to rejoin their families. Speaking to Reuters, he said, quote, "I have a small child. I wanted to get back to my family." However, once they joined, the reality was far harsher than any of them had imagined. Those who faltered or showed hesitation were beaten. In some cases, those who disobeyed orders or tried to flee were executed, their deaths used as a lesson for the rest. After their training, they were sent on meat assaults, a term coined by Ukrainian soldiers to describe the massive waves of Russians rushing a position with little cover in order to try and overwhelm the defenders by the sheer force of their numbers. So it's no surprise that these convicts were among the first to turn violent once they got back home. Azamat Iskaliev, convicted for the murder of his wife, was only a few years into a 9-year sentence when the war offered him a way out. Pardoned in exchange for 6 months on the Ukrainian front, Iskaliev returned, tried to pursue an ex-girlfriend, and killed her after she rejected his advances. War, to the surprise of nobody, does not rehabilitate violent offenders. It often magnifies the worst of their instincts and teaches them new ways to apply their violence. More than that, it can eliminate any fear that they had of law enforcement, especially when the Russian president himself has issued their pardons, removing a key deterrent that might have kept their darker tendencies in check. And it has had devastating effects on their communities. Mariana Katsarova, a UN-backed human rights expert, told reporters, many of them who return, and this is an emerging trend, have been perpetrating new violent crimes to begin with against women, against girls, against children, including sexual violence and killings. End quote. And we want to emphasize again that this violence is currently being perpetrated by the first wave of soldiers to return from the battlefield. When, or maybe if, the war ends, more of these convicts will pour back into Russian society, and unless something changes, the violence seems destined to multiply. But the convicts are just one part of a complex problem. The second is the ease with which they and other criminals can get access to weapons. According to Dr. Mark Galeotti, one of the leading experts on Russian crime, Russia had a massive problem with illegal weapons even before the 2022 invasion. Since 2022, the volume and sophistication of arms slipping into Russia has multiplied many times over, causing a spike in the rate of gun crime. Compounding this situation is a push by several influential politicians from the ruling United Russia bloc to loosen gun control laws, especially for war veterans. They believe that the veterans can handle weapons responsibly and that keeping them armed provides social protection. Critics argue the opposite, that this will blur the lines between legal and illegal firearms, creating a cover for trafficking and spreading illegal weapons throughout the country. Our not particularly hot take? The critics are probably right on this one, aren't they? The convicts and the weapons are just one part of this equation, though. The Kremlin made other choices that are feeding into the crisis. Let's look at the economy. For the past 3 years, the Russian economy has been running hot, fueled by government contracts and military spending. That has kept GDP numbers looking deceptively healthy in the short term. However, analysts believe that the country's longer-term economic outlook is becoming increasingly precarious. Civilian industries such as timber have been gutted by sanctions, and inflation is eating into whatever pay people earn. The state has leaned so heavily into military production that any slowdown risks massive layoffs and could trigger an economic slowdown. If that happens, the issues plaguing Russian society will be magnified 100-fold. A society that was already grappling with how to reintegrate traumatized veterans and emboldened ex-convicts will now have to deal with mass unemployment. A potential economic collapse poses a significant security risk for Russia, as it might push the very people that the government needs to reintegrate into the hands of organized crime. There's a precedent for this, actually. In the 1990s, in the aftermath of the Soviet economy's collapse, soldiers who had fought in Afghanistan and Chechnya became the backbone of organized crime groups. Some, such as Sergei Demanin, a former senior lieutenant in the Marines, formed their own gangs. This period reshaped Russia's criminal landscape for a generation, and it is not hard to imagine history repeating itself. And we can guarantee that the effects will be felt all over the world. The global fallout. History has proven time and time again that crises in a country as large as Russia are rarely confined within neat geopolitical borders. They ripple like shockwaves from an earthquake. The first and most obvious danger is weapons. Dr. Galeotti believes that since the Russian gun market is nearly saturated from the old guns and the new, weapons will likely flow from Russia to other countries where Russian gangs have a network of allies and clients, such as Spain, Portugal, and Colombia. These arms will fuel conflicts far removed from their original battlefield. And in this, history will once again be rhyming. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Kalashnikovs and rocket-propelled grenades once carried by Soviet troops were suddenly everywhere, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the slums of West Africa. The second is manpower. Russia has created a vast pool of men trained for war. If they return to a country where they have no prospects, they are likely to seek opportunities abroad. Some might choose to join the Afrika Korps, the paramilitary group that rose up to replace the Wagner Group in their missions across various African countries. Others might not want to continue working for the government and might instead be tempted by the myriad of conflicts around the world. They might receive offers from cartels in Mexico or militias in Syria, countries that have a history of recruiting the ex-military personnel of troubled nations. Thirdly, the Central Asian nations close to Russia face their own unique risks if the worst-case scenario plays out. Millions of Central Asian migrants from countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and more work in Russian cities, sending back money to their families. If Russia's economy slows after the war, many could be forced to return home because of the inevitable layoffs. But they will not come back empty-handed. They may bring weapons, drugs, or connections to Russian gangs. This could lead to waves of crime and political instability. Kazakhstan faces a different threat. It shares a 9,598.6-kilometer border with Russia and is home to a large Russian-speaking population. Kazakhstan has long been a target of Russian nationalist rhetoric, and one could envision a situation in which armed veterans rally around calls to defend Russians abroad, similar to the calls Moscow made in the lead-up to the invasion of Ukraine. Astana could face provocations that are difficult to control. These may not come as official invasions, but rather as freelance militias, while the Kremlin officially denies responsibility. And if that sounds like us diving off the deep end into a sea of paranoia, just know that the Kremlin has already hinted at designs on Kazakhstan. In mid-2022, former President Dmitry Medvedev wrote a screed on VKontakte, setting out a historical claim for Kazakh lands and declaring, quote, "Kazakhstan is an artificial state." Astute viewers will note that this is exactly the sort of language the Kremlin uses about Ukraine, while the use of freelance militias to infiltrate a neighbor is the same playbook used at the start of the Donbass War in 2014. To be fair, Medvedev later claimed his account had been hacked and the post was taken down. But still, It's not hard to find polling from across the last 3 years that suggests a significant minority of Kazakhs are deeply worried about a military incursion from their northern neighbor. Whether or not the Kremlin launches a full-fledged invasion of Astana, or as they might call it, a special military operation, depends on how the final days of the Ukraine war play out. A successful Moscow might have a greater appetite for war. Cybercrime is another arena where the impact of a crisis could be felt. According to Politico, the Kremlin has become reliant on cybercriminal groups loyal to Moscow to support the country's war in Ukraine. Once the war is over, these groups, emboldened by the support they have received from the Kremlin, might continue to conduct cyber attacks, but this time with a wider range of targets. Ransomware attacks on European hospitals, sabotage of infrastructure in the United States, or financial hacking in Asia could all be traced back to disillusioned Russian veterans making money on the side in such a scenario. Is this inevitable? So, if this is the worst-case scenario, not just for Russia, but the entire world, we have to ask, is it actually inevitable, or is it even particularly likely? For President Putin, it's not. According to 3 sources who spoke to Reuters, Putin views the prospect of an army returning en masse as a potential risk he wants to carefully manage in order to avoid destabilizing society and the political system he has built. The sources emphasize that the president is wary of repeating the same mistakes that happened at the end of the Afghan war. That is why the Kremlin has begun to harden its internal security forces. The Rosgvardia, Russians' version of the National Guard, recently announced that it would be reintroducing tank units. According to the Op4 journal Substack, this decision is portrayed as necessary to bolster the firepower of Russian internal security forces and boost their interoperability with the conventional military. However, the author questioned that justification as Rosgvardia's role in the war has diminished since the initial invasion. They believe that the upgrades are linked to fears within Russia of the security impact of the demobilization. In other words, Russia's strategy is basically not to prevent the fire, but to have enough firemen for when the flames inevitably appear. Dr. Mark Galeotti offers a different suggestion. In a paper for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, he argues that Russia should develop a comprehensive disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration (DDR) plan to tackle the ongoing crisis. DDR is not a unique idea and has been attempted in many conflicts around the world, such as Liberia and the DRC, with varying levels of success. Dr. Galeotti believes this is Russia's only path away from the crisis. On disarmament, he warns that without an immediate and credible program to collect the trophy weapons picked up from Ukraine, Russia will lose any chance of reversing the tide of illegal weapons. And not just the weapons coming in from Ukraine, but those in the hands of the gangs. Proper disarmament would require systematic buyback schemes, strict amnesties for veterans who surrender their arms, and tighter oversight of the country's poorest border regions where trafficking thrives. Beyond the weapons lies the thornier question of demobilization, or rather, how to send soldiers home after the war. The traditional route of sending them home involves a handshake, a paycheck, and a medal. That's a recipe for disaster here. Russia requires a structured exit program that emphasizes several important factors. 1. Screenings for trauma and addiction to ensure that soldiers get the proper help they need once they're out of the army. 2. Staggering the releases instead of releasing all the soldiers at once. And 3. Transitional employment to prevent former soldiers from sinking into joblessness. And finally, there's the most difficult part: reintegration. To properly reintegrate the soldiers, the Russian establishment must acknowledge the challenges that these men are going through. They're dealing with PTSD, substance abuse, and a learned dependency on violence which will affect how they interact with civilians. To handle this, Russia needs to invest heavily in healthcare and welfare. If reintroduction fails, veterans will not just be criminals in waiting, they will become a political constituency of angry, disillusioned men who feel betrayed by the state. And these are the most dangerous men of all. Thank you for watching.